Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Maria Daltrouche, and I'm the advisor to the New York State Commission on African American History. This is our second public meeting, and we are so pleased to be here at the Phillips Manor Hall, where we have been just shown such great hospitality by the amazing staff here. To officially welcome us into this space, I'd like to invite Michael Lord, the Historic Site Director here at Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site. This is New York State's oldest site and most recent park that embraces the Our Whole History initiative. Previously, Michael worked as a research consultant with Amaze Design, collaborating on the development of the Our Whole History exhibit at Phillips Manor Hall. He was also the key historian behind Historic Hudson Valley's award-winning interactive documentary, People Not Property, Stories of Colonial Enslavement in the North. Michael has spent decades in the museum field, where I highly recommend you encourage other young people to get into. I myself am from the museum field, and he has focused on public history research and preparations examining the enslaved experience in colonial New York. Michael holds bachelor's degrees in history and Black studies from Amherst College and a master's degree in American studies from the College of William and Mary. Please join me in welcoming Michael Lord.
Thank you, Maria. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the public portion here of the New York State Commission on African American History. On behalf of the commissioners, we thank you for attending today's meeting. I've been asked to say a few words about Phillips Manor Hall and the stories that we tell here in our new permanent exhibit. Phillips Manor Hall was chosen in part, I think, to host today's meeting because we've committed ourselves to telling a story that is both inclusive and equitable. The title of our new permanent exhibit is Our Whole History. It engages the public by presenting the convergence of three distinct cultures: the Munsee Lenape, European colonizers, and African captives, and how these groups both adapted and conflicted with each other as their respective complicated relationships intersected over the course of 2 full centuries. 3 separate cultures originating from 3 separate continents, converging here along the Hudson River in the 17th and 18th centuries. Phillips Manor Hall's new permanent exhibit shows history as context, background information that is tied to the present because it answers questions posed by people today. History connects the past with the present, and it changes based on who's asking those questions. And a tremendous amount of time and effort was put into the creation of this exhibit so it would inform, educate, and engage the public. And without going into much detail, I do want to say that museums themselves are possibly the best venue to raise awareness of very difficult and complicated stories such as this. Museums enable viewers and visitors to learn, to reflect, and to question previously held beliefs. Museums have become places for civic engagement and for debate. Phillips Manor Hall's new exhibit asks a key question. Oftentimes we end up asking very broad questions here. Did you know questions? Things like, did you know slavery existed in New York? And of course we answer those questions. We also go a little deeper. Not only did slavery exist in New York, slavery existed in every colony in North and South America, from Canada to Chile in the 17th and 18th centuries. We'll go another step deeper. Did you know slavery actually existed in New York longer than freedom has existed in New York? So those are the questions we pose to our visitors, and those are the questions we want visitors to go away thinking about. me break it down just quickly here. Being enslaved meant that an individual had no legal human rights. Because a person considered property could not wed, spouses and families could and were separated at the enslaver's choice, in a person's will, a child's wedding, or to pay off a debt. Children could be and were sold away from parents. Here at Phillips Manor Hall, we talk about the Phillips family. Phillipses were enslavers. In 1750, Frederick Phillips II, the lord of the manor here, inherited his late uncle's estate. And at that time, Phillips II was not interested in his uncle's estate up in Tarrytown. He immediately looked to liquidate his movable property. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that he puts individuals and objects up for sale. This is a copy of a public vendue or an auction at 10 o'clock Thursday morning on the 19th of April. What we're seeing here is a document that is listing the sale, the auction of 4 men, including a miller, a boatman, 2 farmers, 3 women, 6 boys, girls, household goods, sheep, hogs, all in one document. Sold that day for 62 pounds sterling was a child named Sam. You look closely to Abraham de Peister, paying for Sam for 62 pounds sterling. This was the document that lists Sam's sale. Now Sam, according to the inventory taken in 1750, if you look down under boys, Sam's listed there, he's 8 years old. There's a man listed in the men named Samson, most likely Sam's father. One of those 5 women, most likely Sam's mother. So, for just a second, imagine this. Be Sam's father or mother. And imagine having to watch your child at an auction block being sold for 62 pounds sterling away from you. This is what it means to be enslaved. And these are the stories that we have to tell in Phillips Manor Hall. In New York, as in every colony, enslaved people had to wake up every single day of their lives not knowing if they were going to see their family that night. And that unimaginable stress and insecurity was universal within enslaved communities, north and south, rural and urban. And nobody here can tell me that slavery was easier or that enslavers in New York were somehow kinder than anywhere else. If a visitor comes to Phillips Manor Hall, tours the exhibit, and walks away saying, you know, I didn't know that, that's okay with me. But I'd rather have them walk away saying, you know, I never thought of it that way before. It's the difference between being presented with new information versus understanding something about yourself in relation to history. And that, my friends, is making a connection between past and present. And it's that personal connection that can move a visitor from simply learning some new facts to understanding an issue, an event, or a person of the past and how it impacted them. This exhibit and the research that went into it can provide visitors with the nuances and the complexity of this story that goes far beyond countering any type of conventional wisdom. The history we tell at Phillips Manor Hall is not a quest for the truth. Truth is somewhat subjective, based on who's writing it down. And for me, the Phillips Manor Hall story is about perspective, multiple perspectives. The more points of view we have on a specific time or a place or an issue or an event or a person, the more three-dimensional that past becomes. The Nigerian poet and author and activist Chinua Achebe once said, "Until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." I believe and I hope that Phillips Manor Hall, not being, I guess, too presumptive here, is now a space that gives voice to the lion's story. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lord, and also to your amazing staff who's really interpreting, welcoming, greeting, and holding up that lion's story and everything they do. So thank you to that staff as well here today, who's also been so gracious to the commission. We will now turn to a singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which you may know as the Negro National Anthem, so dubbed by the NAACP many, many years stuck with it because it works. If you do not have all three verses present before you, feel free to hum along for those of us who will be singing along each word. We'll be led in this singing by Cecilia Tucker Myers, who is a world-renowned soprano who makes her home here in Yonkers, where she is such a stellar performer in her own right that she has been given the gift of teaching others. So that may be how you know her. You might know a student she's taught, you might have heard her choirs performing, but she herself is an amazing performer, and we'll get to hear that as she leads us and then as she brings us two selections. She's performed with the Roanoke Symphony in Roanoke, Virginia, the Yonkers Philharmonic, Symphony St. Palia, Tri-County Opera Company, New Rochelle Opera Company, the Westchester Opera Company, Remain Opera Company as Hagar in Henry Malcolm's Hotel Eden, and Manhattan School of Music production of Smetana's The Kiss. Cecilia performed the role of the mother in Amal and the Night Visitor. She presently sings in 7 languages. She recorded Robert Frost's poems Revelations for Alvin Ailey's American Dance Theater with Barbara Hendricks and the late composer and her friend, Moses Hogan, and the GIA Publications recording of Guide My Feet. Where has she performed? Well, she's here tonight with us, and she comes to us from the Winter Garden, Rich Forum in Stamford, Connecticut, where she debuted at Alice Tully Hall, performed at Merkin Hall, Carnegie Hall, Whale Recital Hall, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Tarrytown Music Hall, and, of course, the Apollo. She has performed in Italy and in Germany, and she returned to Lincoln Center this season, singing a solo recital in the No Forgotten Voices series, sponsored by Courtney Stars of Tomorrow and the prophetess Anna and Timothy Amaclay's Christmas cantata, What Sweeter Music. I could go on, and in the interest of time, I will stop. But it is just so lovely to be here in Yonkers as at this commission public meeting, lifting up this local talent who will lead us through Lift Every Voice and Sing, and then 2 additional selections. Please rise for the singing of the Negro National Anthem.
taken from a song that we know traditionally. I'm so glad trouble don't last always. And how do we fit what he has written into that idiom of, am I going to sound like a European classical singer? Or am I going to sound like somebody from Pentecostal flavor, which I am, who can do a little bit of jazz, add a little bit of blues, with the help of the chording that Robert Morris wrote. I'm going to try to give that to you this evening. I'm so glad trouble don't last always, or as he entitles it, Gospel Blues. And the second piece I'm going to do, I Want to Be Ready. Another song that, if we listen to the text, and we think about our heritage, our forefathers, what possibly could have been on their minds as they were going through the trials and tribulations that they endured, so that we could be here today, so that I could come on board, be a classically trained artist, and still sing the words that harness our hearts. And it doesn't matter really the color of your skin. Everybody's going to go through something if you've been placed on this planet. But if you have an idea of what they hoped for, and that is the life after this one, then I want to be ready. Want to be ready. So, gospel blues first.
how we start our meetings. Hope to see you at more of them around the state. That's just the start. You thought you were just gonna come see a little meeting, got a whole concert. Look at you all. Okay, so now I'm happy to turn the meeting over to the chair of the New York State Commission on African American History, Secretary of State, Robert Rodriguez.
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everyone. I am honored to be serving as Governor Hochul's chairperson to this very prestigious commission. But before we begin, I have to thank Phillips Manor State Historic Site for hosting us. They've done a wonderful job, and a very special thank you goes to the New York Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation personnel, including Michael Lord, who you heard from, the site manager for Phillips Manor Hall, Lavada Nahon, the interpreter of the African American history, and our wonderful tour guide for today. I think she blew a few minds for many of the participants, and of course all of the staff for all the work that they've done behind the scenes to help us organize this event. And of course to members of the commission for volunteering their time and serving with us as commission members. I also want to acknowledge the presence of a number of our colleagues in government who are here with us today, such as the New York State Division of Human Rights Commissioner, Maria Imperial. And I think her deputy, the New York State Division Commission of Human Rights First Deputy, Cecily Harris. And we do have our Commissioner of Parks with us, Eric Felicite. He's going to be presenting a little bit later on. And as a former legislator, I'm always especially appreciative of recognizing our state Senate Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart Cousins. And we know you would be remiss in these occasions if you go to their district and you do not give them an opportunity to present greetings or a welcoming remark. So if you could, Senate Majority Leader.
Yes. I'm not going to be formal or long. You would be, yes, remiss if you were in my district. Say something. And I would be remiss, even though I do have to go, if I didn't stop by. And thank you for being here to talk about the history, the whole history, and to really help us to celebrate what's happened. We would also understand the investment, obviously, of state dollars in the renovation of this place as something that we in the legislature are really, really happy to support the governor and all those who want to preserve the history. I've lived here, and Eric has heard this, the commission has heard this before, but when I first got into government, they were trying to close this hall because it was in the middle of a community that they did not feel mattered much. And one of the first things that I did when I joined city government was work with the state legislatures at the time representing me to preserve this hall. So we've come a long way. And to host we'll never be on the chopping block, thank God. But, so I want to thank you, and like I said, I feel like I should know each and every one of you. I feel bad that I don't. I have to give special props, obviously, to Dr. Dukes, you just look yesterday. I know you come to my hood. And Dr. Young, I just saw you last week, very, very strong in MBK. And of course, the secretary say thank you, Rob. I think your constituents have to be nice to you too, right? Dr. Small, I get to appoint two people to the commission, and Dr. Small and thank you so much for serving, and Dr. Christina Greer is also one of my two appointees. I do not, so let me formally thank you, Dr. McCray and Dr. Taylor. We are in the presence of luminaries, historians, and people who will keep true to what it is that we've come to do, and in a time where Charles, we're from about.
All right.
Representing Congressman Ronald.
Great, thank you. So the meeting will come to order. So in 2022, by executive order, Governor Hochul announced the creation of the New York State Commission on African American History. Now our purpose, to reiterate, it's to strategize, to brainstorm, and ultimately to present ideas that recognize the full histories, the rich legacies, and the cultural contributions made by African Americans and Black New Yorkers, contributions to our state and nation in spite of every barrier, obstacle, and persecution faced. As we heard earlier today, right here in Phillips Manor and all throughout our state and our continent, the African American and Black New York Black community has experienced a number of different travails. This commission is comprised of highly accomplished and dedicated public servants whom are gathering over the year to decide how we ensure that New Yorkers have a better understanding of this, our history. To ensure that African Americans and Black New Yorkers are uplifted and recognized for their beneficial impact on the health, economic prosperity, public safety, and general welfare of all New Yorkers. And we will do this by partnering with community-based organizations and by bringing New Yorkers into the conversation through events, cultural programming, scholarly research, and other activities. It's a recognition that has taken far too long, and I thank the governor for making this a priority as we strive for a more inclusive future. One thing has not changed, and that is the need to draw inspiration and guidance from the past. To build an inclusive future, we must know our past and to draw inspiration and guidance as we work towards building an inclusive present and future. So we honor and celebrate this Black History Month, buildings, including this one like we are now in, that serve as witness to the cultural history of a community and help to give people a sense of place and connection. So Phillips Manor Hall, it provides a unique window into early colonial era life in New York, and I encourage everyone to take the virtual tour as well if you have not seen that yet. However, the building did not include the story of all the individuals that lived and worked here. And under Governor Hochul's leadership, they mentioned a significant investment, including with the legislature, a $20 million grant that was provided to Phillips Manor Hall to rehabilitate this site and to include new exhibits that document the story of the indigenous people and enslaved Africans whose work and trade allowed the Phillips family to prosper during the pre-revolutionary era. And while past exhibits and lectures have documented the role that Africans and indigenous people have contributed to New York State history, these expanded permanent exhibits more fully depict and share the complex history with visitors. So to learn more about this and the efforts to include diverse perspectives within the state park system, as well as several historically significant sites in communities across New York, allow me to introduce the New York State's Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Commission Commissioner Eric Kulisay. And Lavada Nahon, who I mentioned blew many minds, who may be helping out with this. But since 2019, Commissioner Kulisay has led New York State Parks through the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as major capital initiatives, including the opening of the new Shirley Chisholm State Park in Brooklyn, another award-winning rebuilding project at Niagara Falls State Park, which is gorgeous, the new Jones Beach Energy and Nature Center on Long Island, planned new parks in Kingston and Rochester, and the opening of the Autism Nature Trail in Letchworth State Park. A first-of-its-kind trail specifically designed for people on the autism spectrum and their families. So under Eric's tenure, state parks and historic sites have set annual attendance records in 2019, 2020, and 2021.
So Eric is focused on rebuilding New York's unsurpassed state park system, expanding access to the broadest cross-section of New Yorkers and visitors, embracing new technologies, efficiencies, and fostering the commercial, nonprofit, and volunteer public-private partnerships that are so crucial to delivering the best visitor experience possible. And let me speak a little bit about Lavada Nahon, and the interpreter of African American history for the State Parks Bureau of Historic Sites. In addition, she is a culinary historian focused on the 17th to 19th centuries Mid-Atlantic region with an emphasis on the work of enslaved cooks in the homes of the elite class. She's also a generalist in New York African American history, 19th century through the 20th century, and has 20 years of public history experience working with a variety of historic sites, societies, and museums across the tri-state region. We look forward to hearing from both Commissioner Kulisek and Ms. Nahon.
Thank you, Secretary. That's very kind of you. And I won't talk long, but I got to get out of the way because Lavada is the star of the show. Lavada is a real star of this whole place. On behalf of Governor Hochul, it is I'm really honored to invite this group to Phillips Manor Hall. We are incredibly proud of what we've done here. We feel like we've done something new in the state park system, so we're very glad to have you all here to see what we've done. As you've heard, and also the majority of leaders for the cousins are only here, but she has also been, as she said, she and the Senate have been huge supporters of our parks, and that actually, we couldn't do it without them. We're grateful to the legislature for everything that's happening here and across the state. And thanks to Michael Lord, who you've heard from before. So we mentioned this our whole history, and it is really an approach to provide. We're doing this statewide. It's an effort to bring multiple perspectives to create relevancy and meaning for today. We have an awful lot of state historic sites that relate to the Revolutionary War or the grand estates of the Hudson Valley, and it's been tempting, obviously, in the last 100 years to tell the story of the families who lived in those places. And obviously, there are the families were probably the smallest number of people who lived in these places, and there's much richer, stronger stories there. And this place, what we did here, Phillips Manor Hall, dates to 1682, so to the very early origins of New York as a place, as a European place. Obviously, this place is long predated by Native American cultures. But it's a remarkable place, and it actually provided a great venue to do what you're seeing here. It was a very historic structure, but with very little original content, so we could come in here and put in exhibits and tell this really very rich story of the multiple cultures that lived in this place, came to this place, and were affected by it. As you've seen, and you'll hear more about it, this is our largest single investment in the state historic site in history. It took, I think, in this place, as the senator said, also is a touchstone for the city. It is so wrapped up in the city throughout its existence. So it's great that we feel privileged to have the honor of enlivening it, bring back these exhibits to provide a lot of interpretation. We're not just doing it here. We've also recently revamped Washington's headquarters in Newburgh. It's a site where he spent the longest time he spent anywhere during the American Revolutionary War, where we now tell the story of Washington as politician, as general, as plantation owner, and as slaveholder. We wanted to make sure that story is told. We hired Lavada Nahon here to help us tell these stories, to make sure these stories are being told across the state. And then we hope that you've been around, you've seen all the exhibits and learned from every single exhibit, brings multiple perspectives to the table, as Michael mentioned. And it was an honor really for us to put it together. This last week, this past Monday, we held the inaugural Northern Slavery Collective Conference, and last evening we held an in-person gathering here titled Doing the Work, How Including the Enslaved Expands in Our Understanding of Colonial New York. These are really the aspirational that we had when we did this place. Historians have identified over 100 named individuals enslaved by the Phillips family at their properties in Manhattan and Westchester. The Phillips's fleet of ships, part of the transatlantic slave trade. Thousands of African Americans were taken to sugar plantations in the Caribbean, but some came to Westchester County to help operate and build mills. We are so glad to have you here. Thank you, Secretary, for bringing this organization here. We are proud to show it off. And thank you to the Commission on African American History for joining us. And now, it is my great pleasure. This woman is a superstar. You can speak words to her background, her talents, but she took this on. She brought this into her heart. She took this project on. It was obviously a project that could have gone wrong in so many ways. It could have been difficult to present all these perspectives. And Labata poured her soul into this project, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. To the Commission, to Commissioner Felice, and my colleague. Since everyone has spoken about the Iroquois history, I will keep my remarks just very brief. The term Iroquois history was first referenced in 2021 in the State of the State Program book. Refers not just to the exhibit here, but to a guideline for restoring the historic narratives, the presence, and stories of multiple people who have been traditionally left out of American history. This initiative seeks to embrace, elevate, and celebrate New York's history to attract both new and returning audiences to our park system and places New York State history, sites, parks, and other locations firmly in the public square. Our whole history gives equal weight to the stories of sacrifice, achievement, culture, personhood of all. This is an approach that we have been using within the state park system for nearly 30 years, beginning with the opening of the Namdagam, the home of the Hanadasi. It brings into alignment all of the narratives, many of which are often referred to as undertold stories. These stories speak to the lives of people who may be referenced in a tour or on an exhibit panel, but generally just in a few words. If they are mentioned at all, their roles have been so simplified that they are quickly forgotten. Saying things like, they had slaves, or his wife and children, or even the gardeners, the tenants, the boatmen, the Indians, denies the importance of this portion of our historic population in relationship to society overall. As the Commissioner mentioned, this is an initiative, it is a lens through which Parks is working all across the state. Every sign that we produce, every exhibit we make, hopefully not as quickly as we did here. The work at this exhibit actually happened in 1 year. We were graced because of supply chain issues with a few more months, so we can say it took us 18 months. The level of research here normally would take us 3 to 5 years. But that timeline also speaks to the need that we have here in New York to bring our history from documents into books, into public awareness. And I'm looking forward to working with the Commission and hope that we can support you through Parks however way we can. It is vital that we look to particularly 2 anniversaries that we have coming up. In 2026, we'll be commemorating the 400th anniversary of the arrival or purchase of the first 11 men enslaved in our colony and now in our state area. In 2027, we will be commemorating the 200th anniversary of emancipation. Unlike what most of us think, we all studied the Emancipation Proclamation, where one day people were enslaved, the next day they were free. In New York, however, the emancipation only ended legal enslavement, the action of slavery. However, it did not free many people who were held in bondage. One day they were a slave, the next day they were an indentured servant. Slavery in New York does not completely end till we are nearly in 1848, much closer to the Civil War than people realize. This is history we are bringing forward. This is history we're looking for your help to bring even more to public awareness. I thank you all for coming. I thank you all for the support that you give to our parks and historic sites by giving us a visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Kulised, and thank you, Levada, and the colleagues for sharing our whole history initiative with all of us. And thank you all to the members of the commission for your presence and thoughtful insight and perspectives in our ongoing collaboration and meetings here. And I look forward to having a meaningful conversation in the weeks and months and years to come as we produce the document that is our recommendations for the future. But most importantly, it's about the public. It's about how you can get involved. It's about your presence here tonight as a start. So we ask for individuals physically in attendance. You can provide your feedback and your comments regarding the commission's work by filling out an index card located at the registration table. And for individuals participating virtually, you can share your thoughts and ideas on our website. There's also pamphlets going around with QR codes. That's another way that you can get the information if you don't want to do that in writing in a form here. Also, please continue to check our website for updates on our future meetings and our next meetings. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maria. And of course, thank you all for coming. We truly appreciate your participation.
Thank you, Commissioner Chair Rodriguez, and thank you to our speakers from the Parks Preservation and Parks Recreation and Historic Preservation. I think in addition to the applause we've offered and kind of the aha in our brain right now, if I didn't bring my phone up to prevent feedback, but I think one thing we can all do as members of the public, as folks in this community, is go into those super handy devices, open up your calendar app, and plan the day that you'll come back here for a visit with a person you know, a neighbor, a family member, maybe a young person. All of this is here, has been labored over and presented excellently. It would be such a shame to let it go to waste. So, back to our program, and that's something seriously y'all can do. Like, we're not going to judge you for taking out your phones right now. Do it with some in mind. If it's not on the calendar, it's not happening. So, one of the things the commission does, which the chair shared in his opening remarks, is bringing New Yorkers together, partnering with people. And so the state has this Our Whole initiative, which is being excellently executed through the Parks Department. And then what's happening right here? Right? What's happening right here? We thought it would be important to hear from folks who are local to the Hudson Valley and Westchester County about work that's ongoing to preserve and promote history that is local to us. And we know that in sharing this with the commission, that this is not the only site in New York where this is happening, that in every region, as we heard earlier today, commissioners, there are historical societies, public historians, local teachers and librarians who are just searching for bridges to connect the work they're doing with the people they want to get that work in front of. And so we're very lucky today to have with us two people from this area who will just share briefly some of the work they have produced and are working on that we here in this community can take hold of and be a part of as well. The first will be Dr. Myra Armstead. I'm just looking, eye contact, yes, hi. It's so nice to meet people in person. I don't know these people, it's like great. Dr. Armstead is the Vice President for Academic Inclusive Excellence and the Lyford Patterson Edwards and Helen Gray Edwards Professor of Historical Studies at Bard College. In addition, Dr. Armstead is the author of numerous books, including Lord, Please Don't Take Me in August, a comparative study of Black life in the resort communities of Saratoga Springs, New York, and Newport, Rhode Island, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And she has authored Tall Within, Black Identity in the Hudson Valley. There are several other books, including her work and research on James Gardner, James Brown, who was a gardener. There you go.
Sure.
And a well-known one in this area while he was working on his home here in the county. And so without further ado, Dr. Armstead, please do join us and share with us some of your wisdom and research about the lives of Black folk here in Hudson Valley.
First of all, I want to say how gratifying it is to be here. I'm looking forward to retirement after decades at Bard, and I have to say that I've devoted my entire life to our whole history. When I was in graduate school, I was a student of John Franklin. I was very, very fortunate. And some of you know that he was a pioneer in 20th century Black history. And we used to say to ourselves, those of us who were interested in the topics that I study, African American history, that African American history is American history. We used to say that almost as a mantra, and we'd always repeat that at professional conferences. By that we meant that African American history should not be siloed. It's not some sidebar. It is very much integrated into the fabric of what makes American history. John Franklin himself, some people would be surprised to know, was not a supporter of African American studies programs because he felt that that would lead or support the siloing, even as he authored numerous works in African American history. I don't know if I would go so far as he did on that, but today what I thought I'd do is just take a couple of examples of my work to show how integrated and how important African American history is in U.S. history, but New York's history in particular. So I want to start with the gardeners that Lavada mentioned, the ones that are just sort of casually referred to. As a matter of fact, I came to the study of James F. Brown that way. I was asked to be a part of a consulting group that was helping Mount Julian back in 2005, which is a National Historic Site, interpret its programs or reinterpret its programs. And so those of us who were on that panel were shown the historic artifacts and, any material or documents related to the importance of that site. And then we were given a tour. So as we were getting ready to leave, we went through a room and there was a period table and a huge volume. I mean, this just really thick volume with no cover. And I was intrigued by it, so I said to the executive director, who is a friend, so this is not, as the kids say, throwing shade on her, but I said, what's that? And as we all went out to take a tour of the grounds, she said, oh, that's the gardener's diary. So being trained in social history, I was immediately intrigued. I thought, what? A gardener left a diary that's over 30-some years old? And so I thought, this is something I'm going to tell them they need to interpret. And then maybe 5 minutes into the tour, she said, oh, he was African American. And I thought, oh, eureka. And that led to my work. But maybe a couple of things I'll say about James Brown. He was a fugitive from Maryland. He was not a native New Yorker. But he ran away, and he did so quite strategically, from Maryland to Dutchess County. He did so in 1827. Why? 1827, because he knew that officially, according to the law, that manumission was now the law of the land. But what I want to point to in that is the existence of these communication networks that were cross-regional. And I think that's very important in understanding national history, the way it's taught, because we're often taught, you know, there was this divide, this sectional divide, north-south, and that was real, but at the same time, there were people who crossed borders in anti-slavery activity through various networks. The Quakers were one, and certainly the AME Church and the AME Zion Church. So it's very clear from the evidence, some of it circumstantial, some of it sort of smoking gun, that James F. Brown was able to take advantage of that information and get to Dutchess County. In particular, there was a family called Cyrus Newland, or headed by Cyrus Newland, and it turned out he was from Delaware, and he had property in Dutchess County that he left to his son, who married into the Verplank family that hired James when he ran away. That's just a little tidbit of how these networks worked. At the same time, James was discovered because he wasn't formally manumitted. He still belonged to his owner in Maryland when he ran away. He was discovered shortly after he was hired by the Verplanks in their New York City home on Wall Street as a waiter by one of the friends of the Susan F. Williams family. Susan F. Williams was his owner, and that person reported it. She began a correspondence with Daniel Cromlin Verplank, who basically came to terms with her. So there was a kind of complicated set of exchanges involving Daniel as a kind of advocate, Susan F. Williams, the owner, John Needles, a Quaker, and in Baltimore, and James F. Brown himself. And I think that whole story sort of complicates our understanding of the process of manumission, the geography of manumission, but the people involved. And that is the richness of New York State history. So that's one example. Now, he was a gardener, and I do want to talk a little bit about horticulture and what horticulture meant during his lifetime. He lived from 1793 to 1868. So he was born in the first years of the new Republic of United States of America, and the founding fathers were men of the Enlightenment, very serious about scientific experimentation and what that might yield in terms of understandings of economic possibilities, because they understood that if this fledgling nation was to succeed, it would need an independent economic base. So they fostered experimentation and exchange. They were involved in societies that were cross-Atlantic, corresponding with people in England about plants and flowers. There's much to be said about this, but New York is important because New York was the site of the first horticultural society in this country. Now, as it turns out, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, famous now, because of the Philadelphia Flower Show and John Bertram, sort of outshone the New York Historical Society in time. But the New York Historical Society was the first, and James F. Brown was very much involved in this world. He was involved in experimentation. There were journals. He was literate, and they were constantly exchanging information about, the latest cross-fertilization, etc. That takes me to Alexander Gilson,
who was a gardener at Montgomery Place. Now, Montgomery Place is in Red Hook, near Rhinebeck. It's a National Historic Site. Usually celebrated for its beauty, simply its aesthetic beauty. It was a pleasure ground. Andrew Jackson Downing, who was the foremost landscape architect of his time, used it as an example and wrote about it. But very few people realize that Alexander Gilson, who was born around 1824, either indentured or free, we're still trying to figure that one out, became the master gardener there. And he also was involved in this world of experimentation, and in fact, had 2 species named after him in the Latin. Begonia gilsoni, so every time I see begonias, you know, I look at that, I think of him, and a kind of coleus that's named after him as well. So, you know, when we think of these gardeners, I think very often we just assume they were manual workers, they were just sort of digging around in the dirt, but how many more might there have been? I was talking to Levada just the other day, and I'm hoping that, you know, I'll turn to a tie-in to John Jay, because James F. Brown, in his diary, left a very cryptic line saying, "Went with Peter J." And there's a gap in the diary, and then he comes back, and when he comes back, he assumes the master gardener role at Mount Julian. So I sort of am speculating that there was some kind of apprenticeship there. So as a final example, now I'm going to read to just finish up. I'm going to draw from my latest work on the Upper Hudson Valley, which was a book that I just finished, hooray, through the pandemic, you know, the lack of access to the archives. Everybody knows about that. And this was a book that was commissioned by the Organization of American Historians, the National Park Service. It will be available at the websites of both of these groups free of charge to the public as a public history project sometime this spring. And the book is called Memory and Enslavement, Schuyler House, Old Saratoga and the Saratoga Patent in History, Historical Practice, and Historical Imagination. And what this work allowed us to do was to reinterpret a site that has significance in U.S. history. All of you may remember 5th grade, 8th grade, somewhere in social studies, learning about the battles of Saratoga, the turning point of the Revolution, and from school or either the play Hamilton about Philip Schuyler, General Schuyler, who was head of the Northern Department of the U.S. Army for a time until he got relieved of his duties. So this whole site has typically been interpreted as one of military glory and triumph. But with this book, what we look at is a more somber history because Schuyler was, in fact, a slaveholder. And while he was a champion, maybe a slightly reluctant champion of the revolutionary cause, only because he would rather have seen the revolutionaries in Britain kind of come to an understanding, like a lot of the founding fathers, but when Britain proved intransigent, then, okay, we're going to fight. He was a champion of liberty and these high ideals, but in fact was unfazed by his status as a slaveholder. And in my research, I found several examples during the Revolutionary War that were quite disturbing about his commitment to slaveholding. So I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll just talk about, I think, 3 quickly and then end. One was in 1775, which is, you know, right at the time of the start of, you know, Lexington and Concord happened then. There was a sale let me back up. He had a commissary officer, Clothier General, who wrote to him
And this was about transactions that took place in Montreal. We briefly, that is the US forces briefly were able to capture Montreal from the British. The British eventually took it back, but while we had it, this commissary officer and Schuyler were in contact about supplies that were needed and could be gotten, the kinds of things that they could not get through New York City because New York City was occupied by the British. So, you know, the colonies had always imported most of their goods from overseas. So now they could get this stuff through Quebec. So there is a list, and you can imagine me, I just want to sort of invite you for a minute to imagine what it was like to discover this letter. And all of these letters, thousands, literally thousands of letters that the Schuylers kept. And, you know, most of them pretty predictable and not saying much about what I care about. But there is this letter, and this clothier general is listing all that he has been able to procure. Catgut and gauze, and at first I thought, okay, these are medical supplies for the soldiers, and then I began to say, wait a minute, you know, I read a little bit more, and it seems like there was a mixture of, you know, public interest, things that were being bought for the military, but also some personal items for Schuyler, including fine carpets, several fine carpets, and the clothier general goes on to describe them, and then he says, I hope you don't mind, and this is a paraphrase, I hope you don't mind, I kind of went over budget, but I just couldn't resist this carpet. It was just so wonderful, and, you know, the weave, et cetera, so I exchanged the wench. You know, so the wench, that was an enslaved woman, because that's what Black women were called, wenches. And then on top of that, he said, I have to quickly leave because they are beginning to discern her character. Lazy, intemperate, you know, all of these negative things about her. So this is an enslaved woman, and we can, and I do talk about what her possible story was and whether they understood this woman. Of course they didn't. But the fact is that he dumped her. You know, he dumped her. Our commander of the Northern Army. Another example was that there was a mulatto, a biracial man who was taken as a child. His father was African and his mother was Abenaki Indian. And he was taken as a child during the French and Indian War from that land, from Saratoga land, and he ended up, it's a long story, but he ended up in, among the Mohawk, and he he was multilingual, he spoke French, he spoke Mohawk, and he comes back as an adult during the Revolutionary War to Schuylerville, to Saratoga, and offers his services. He says, maybe you could use me. You know, I can get some of the indigenous people on the side of the revolution. In Washington's correspondence with Schuyler and Schuyler's correspondence, we see that they're not too keen about that. They'd rather that the Native Americans remain neutral, but at some point they do agree. Now this was interesting to me because this particular man, his name is Atio Harongwen in in the Mohawk language, but he's known in history books as Lewis Cook. That was his anglicized name. And the fact is that Schuyler approves of him in the end, whereas in all the other correspondence, it is clear that he wants nothing to do with black soldiers. Even in fatigue, operations. He feels they're demoralizing, they're unfit, and that you know, he compares them to boys and old men and worse. So it's sort of ironic that he accepts this one, and in a way de-Africanizes him in order to accept him. And that's largely because he probably didn't know about the heritage of this young man. And then finally, I'll just give you one other example. So that kind of, you know, changes our view of Schuyler, the war hero. And then I'll just give you one other one. Schuyler owned about, at max, 13 enslaved individuals. Mostly about a dozen for the period of his greatest prosperity. And he had a very good relationship with them. But one of them, Scipio, I discovered ran away during the war and joined the British Army because, as some of you know, the British offered freedom to enslaved people who would fight for them. And this Scipio ends up in Canada, which is where most of them went, and there are good Canadian records on him. Interestingly, he drops the Schuyler name altogether. And in the tradition of Montpellier, the home of James Madison, which is leading public history in engaging the descendants of enslaved communities at these sites. And I hope that will happen with Levada, it will, all right? In New York State. The site is now looking into involving that public in the interpretation of the site. So these are some very exciting things that are happening, and these are New York examples of I would say, the essential nature of investigating African American history in this case. I talked a little bit about Indigenous history, but this is Black History Month, so I focused on that in our telling of the whole history of New York State. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Armstead. I might have remembered more about the American Revolution if some of those facts were included in my social studies classes. And I hope that we continue to push toward the oral history. Our last speaker today is another local hero in my book. His name is David Thomas. And as he comes up, I will read briefly his bio, or about his work, which you'll hear more about. Mr. David Thomas is the director of the Friends of the African American Cemetery. The cemetery was established in Rye when its site was deeded to the town on June 27, 1860 by Underhill and Elizabeth Halsted, quote, to be forever after kept and used for the purposes of a cemetery or burial place for the colored inhabitants of the said town of Rye and its vicinity, free and clear of any charge therefore. Literally the first time I realized there were colored inhabitants of Rye in 1860. In the latter part of his life, Underhill Halsted became a fervent follower of the Methodist movement, which was profoundly opposed to slavery. The cemetery includes a variety of professionally carved and dressed gravestones, with 35 indicating that a war veteran is interred. African American veterans of the Civil War through World War II are buried here. In 1983, the African American Cemetery was listed as a Westchester County Tercentennial Historic Site, and in 2003, the cemetery was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And while it's not written here, I am certain that none of that would have been possible, nor been able to be shared today had it not been for the efforts and work of Mr. David Thomas to keep this cemetery's history alive and well.
Well, Holly said something about presentation. I just want you to know that that's not true. I came late to the cemetery. I American Cemetery in Raleigh, and I said, you're out of your mind. Raleigh is the richest community, why would they have African Americans there? Much to my surprise, there it sat. And that was 11 years ago, and since that time, I've worked with the town of Raleigh, who owns the cemetery, to ensure that this place is kept up. The first sentence is basically what you've already known. 281 estimated burials. When I say estimated, because we don't know. The place is about 10 yards short of a football field. Average age of death is 51. Now that spans 100 and some years. 40 children under the age of 12. I can never get this through my head. Because I see these gravestones, and someone comes out and puts little clay figurines of small animals by each grave, and I don't know who it does. And I love them for it. There are actually 24 veterans, so that's a typo, and we're going to correct that. 16 Civil War veterans, 1 Spanish-American War veteran, 5 World War I veterans, 2 World War II veterans. Most common cause of death, lung-related. I don't know why that is. Emphysema, croup, consumption, a lot of them. And I'm really not, and we're trying to figure it out, maybe because Port Chester was an industrial town, and Mamaroneck as well. So we think that maybe these are industrial diseases. Our first story, I have 3 favorite stories I'm going to tell you about, is William Voris. And this was an article that was written by Mr. Howard Husson. Mr. Voris is buried at the cemetery. His descendants are still alive. He escaped slavery in New Jersey and came across the Hudson River with his mother and his son and set up his place in Rye, New York. And he had a thriving restaurant, a boarding house, saloon business on Rye Beach. He sold candy and ice cream, so he was a prominent individual. Voris owned real estate worth $4,500 in 1870. He had his own house. He had assets worth $1,500, and he traded with everyone in the Rye Town community. That meant Harrison, Mamaroneck, Rye-Neck, Port Chester. So he was a well-known entrepreneur and businessman. He rented rooms, seasonal rooms, to waiters and waitresses. Most of them were in his employ, but that was a summer community, so we know he did that. And he wore a gold watch and was a trustee of the Colored Church of Rye, which no longer exists. He died November 16, 1872. The financial panic of 1873 bankrupted his family. He didn't die in poverty, but his family fell into, dire straits. But fortunately, and I knew his great-great-granddaughter, and if any of you know anybody from Raleigh, you'll remember Doris Bailey Reedus. That was his ancestor, his descendant. My second story, and I'm sorry, these are actually photos of his headstone. That headstone is approximately 4.5 feet tall. It's solid marble. You see the top one is in the midst of me cleaning that stone. And then on the left you see that stone, that's the way it looks now. And every year, every 2 years, I got to go back and clean it. Actually, we clean all the stones at the cemetery. So if anybody wants to volunteer, come on. The photo on your right is actually an excavation of Mr. Boris's house, which is near the Rye Meeting House in Rye, New York. And he had a house across the street from the Holsteads. So they were very familiar with each other. James Watson Allen. This is a great story. His descendant is one of our dear friends. Son of a truck driver and Lillian Allen, the most stylish person in the African American cemetery. And I'll show you why. Member of the Northernite Riders of White Plains. And this I didn't know. There was a biracial, integrated motorcycle club in White Plains in the 1920s and 30s. Yeah. And he used to ride around in Easter in top hat and tails in his Harley. Tragically, he died Christmas Day in a motorcycle accident. And he's buried in an unmarked grave. But here's the photo. My favorite photo. I love this photo. That's him in that top hat. I wish I could have seen him. That's him on the left, and his niece told me that he was always clean. He was always clean. That was one thing about Vic we knew. He was clean. And there's the Northern Light Riders at the top. He's third from the left on a motorcycle. And you can tell because that fender has a black stripe in it, just like the one in this picture. Now, the reason why I love this photograph is because it shows a proud black man who was a chauffeur. And in his daily life, he projected this image of pride in himself and his family. And his family, they were members of the Barry Avenue Church, are just as proud today as he was then. This has no pictures because this was one of the, I love this story, but it breaks my heart. And of the 50 or so stories I've uncovered, this is probably one of the saddest. Ida Velarde Reed. She was born in Barbados. Arrived in New York in October 28, 1918. Remember the date? 1918? Pandemic? She was a nurse. She was a trained nurse. And she came here to the U.S. in the Larchmont area to tend to pandemic victims. Within 3 months, she was dead. From ministering to them, courageously attended patients, including mortally ill, until January 19th when she contracted the virus herself. Now, at the time, even though African Americans had acted as nurses since the inception of the United States, most of the country opposed their service since the U.S. was at a low point in race relations. This breaks my heart. African Americans were subject to disenfranchisement, segregation, violence, and viewed as biologically inferior and disease stress. These are just some of the stories that I've uncovered, and I've been told. I haven't researched all of these myself. Every year, and I have ceremonies every year at the site, Memorial Day and Veterans Day, commemorating those who interred there. This was one of the first in 2010. There's Mr. Feynman, Rich Feynman. There he is standing right there next to my beautiful wife. Every year I bring people out to the site. I tell them these stories. And what happens is people approach me and say, these are my ancestors. Here's their story. I used to live in Rye, and I knew of a family that owned a farm here, and they were African American. Do you know them? And this has brought a wealth of information and artifacts that we know belong to those interred at the site. So, if you are out there on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, or if, during the summer you want to stop by, go on my Facebook page, give me a call, send me an email, I'll give you a tour. Because this is a site that needs to be remembered, that needs to be brought into the light. And the stories need to come out. And I speak not only of this site, but of many African American cemeteries that are in Westchester County. And there are a lot. There are a lot. And these were people who contributed to our society, fought for our country. Their children also fought for our country. They died helping out others, black and white. And their story is untold. So thankfully, I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic at all. I'm a contractor. I was, before 11 years ago, I really didn't, I knew nothing about this. But when I heard heard about this cemetery, took a walk through this cemetery, it just grabbed me right by the heart, and I've been at it ever since. So, please come to see my cemetery. Please come help us preserve it and celebrate those who are interred. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas, and to all of our speakers. So you see there are a number of ways to get involved, to remain curious, to pick a thread and pull at it, as I've been watching Enola Gnome's home several times. But there's just so much around us. And I think that what we're hoping in our public meetings and in speaking with people all around the state, that folks will find something that intrigues them, that they're curious about. We just heard two speakers talk about just being curious, right? So again, I know by now you've already put the date in your phone when you'll come back here and do the tour, so that's already taken care of. But also spend some time just walking around your own neighborhood and getting a little more curious and figuring out and asking the question. You're not pestering anyone. You're bringing people into the reality of where we live together, and that's a joy. And so in the spirit of that joy, we will joyfully listen to these instructions on how to share public comment time, which is everyone's favorite time of these meetings. Those of you who have had index cards and used those index cards to write comments or questions, if you can just raise them and we will take them. If you have not gotten an index card but something is bubbling up for you at the top of your heart and you just have to say it, we're gonna give questions priority, right? If you know you don't have a question, guess what? We will give comments second priority, but we're gonna keep those comments super brief. And by comments plural, I mean you have one comment and then someone else will make another comment. And we will do this in cycle until time is called, which will be 10 minutes from now. So first, questions. I have a question. Oh, I will check on those cards, thank you.
I was one of the first, and I just asked.
You can definitely, please.
Of the commission, are you guys aware of the New York State homicide law? It's on the books.
Yes.
It's all about teaching this history in schools. There are amendments to this law that we would really love for you guys to support, because without education, there will be little curiosity. We can work together in this regard. And my colleague is giving you some information about that. That was the one question. The second is, if you don't know about the homicide law, do you see a way that this commission can support education in the schools?
Okay, so that was two questions, and on behalf of all the commissioners, I can say yes to the first, awareness there, thank you. To the second, if there's one commissioner who would like to respond to the second question about potential ways to support or to incorporate education generally of these topics into what we might be thinking of recommending, please, one commissioner.
Sure, I'll take it on as the chair. Education has been highlighted as one of those areas of significant interest in pursuing how we can make sure that this becomes an ongoing effort, either through curriculum or other matters. So what we're discussing, obviously we have Chancellor Young, who I will not put on the spot because he's been such a leader in this area. But it is important to figure out how those previous works, including Amistad, and the conversations around education and curriculum get codified in some way. And I think that we are committed to creating a subcommittee amongst members of the commission to look specifically at education and what changes need to be made to be able to better educate our young people on our history, including the African American history. So I expect recommendations to come out of that subcommittee and out of this body that focus specifically on the content of curriculum, but also how that can be implemented in a way that's different and Some of it may require legislative changes, as you're so advocating for. So that is part of the scope of what we are looking at addressing in the commission's work.
So I just wanted to say, my WAPC president has been working on the Amistad law for years and been meeting with state representatives. We've been to Albany together. She's meeting with a local rep here in the Bronx tomorrow. I'm wondering, how can we get her name on your roster so that when you do start these meetings, she can be involved?
Well, I think what is helpful, we will take your information. I think we want to,
Back of that-
we have your information.
I
And-
mean, she's been working on this
and-
for.
At one of our first meetings of the subcommittee, we'd certainly want to hear your presentation and catch up on those 20 years of work that you've already done and make sure it's not forgotten or missed. So,
And thank you for your decades of labor.
yes, thank you.
We have 2 cards I'll read, and then I see that your hand is up, so it is registered here and will not be overlooked. One question, in what ways will community projects be supported? Will there be funding support, and what will be the process for applying for funding? Of course, assuming that funding will be available. So this is about how work that we're hearing about in local communities could be supported. Any ideas?
Sure, I'll take that one too.
Just put the chair down and talk for the rest of the night.
Well, the other purpose is, one of the things that we talk about in terms of creating a framework and a roadmap for how we recognize African American history and the contribution of Black Americans is doing it in a number of different ways. We've mentioned education. There's also discussion and another new subcommittee on placemaking, on how we recognize the history in people's communities, and how do we do that on an ongoing basis moving forward. And we expect that some of these efforts will require funding, will require financial support. So part of these efforts is to come forward with what is the role of the state in helping to fund some of these different initiatives that we're exploring with communities that may look similar to what you may have heard here so far in terms of what the parks are doing in terms of their initiative, but need to take a different and a broader scope in areas that are not state parks or that are not particular state assets. So it's very important for us to have that broader conversation of what's the state's role, how do we fund that, how do we come forward with the framework in the different areas that we're funding. In particular, I'll just mention, because I'm sure there'll be a question about the third subcommittee that we've identified so far, which is on public engagement, and fits into that conversation of how do we connect with communities on what they are doing or want to be doing around the celebration, research, ongoing discussion around scholarship around African American history in their communities. So those are the 3 identified areas of subcommittees so far. That is not an exhaustive or inclusive list, but it's in our initial deliberations where we thought it would be a good place to start and to start digging in, really look forward to public comment on ideas, thoughts, suggestions, but this is what we've been able to glean from our first meeting and from our initial comments that have come in so far.
Thank you, which fits right into the second question I have, which is, can you share what the process or steps would be like for submitting an idea? And so again, if you have not received one of the palm cards with the QR code on the back, that's the best way. We'll make sure you get those. They're on the table on the way out. Scan that QR code or go to our website if scanning your QR code is not a favorite activity of yours. Our website is also available on that, and you can find the comment form there and leave us the comments. The comment forms have helped us to identify subcommittees that are rising up as themes that we want to focus on, and really helping us to shape our public engagement. Based on what we hear, folks who are engaged with us want us to be engaged with, we're taking action on that. So that is the way to get your ideas to the commission. It is all through that form. I promise you it doesn't go into some technological void. it literally comes to me. So you also don't have to ask me for my email address. Go on the form and we will be in contact with each other. Promise to you. And this gentleman here, and then I see 1, 2, this will be our last due to time, but the conversation will go on and on and on and on and on via the comment form, I know.
Yes, hello, my name is Chief Avenue Clark. Thank you for your work. It's very important. We know that people who were brought here enslaved did not come from a vacuum. They came from civilizations and societies that informed them on the contributions they made to the building of this country and the ability to navigate the conditions that they were in. What plans or intentions does the commission have to delve into that dimension of the issue that's reflected in artifacts and other things that we know exist already?
So if I'm understanding, the question is what level beyond what's happening here in the history of this, but knowing that it comes from a civilization.
Are we paying attention to what happened prior to arriving here that contributed
Yes.
to everything that we know about African American history?
You want to take that, Commissioner Small? Thank you.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for your question, brother. And so absolutely, we're actually in the process of really mapping out and finalizing a framework for the work. And certainly, earlier we were part of a tour, and that's one of the same questions that I brought up. So you can't separate that part of the work because, yes, absolutely, they didn't start here. Matter of fact, New York wasn't even New York when they got here. And so the story, we're going to ensure that there's a lifting of the entire story from all of the perspectives that are important. So certainly, yes, and please stay in touch with us because as we continue to really map out the framework and really solidify the directions that we're going to go into and the different kind of places we're looking to impact, that's certainly part of the story that needs to be lifted, and I'll certainly be advocating that part of the story is certainly lifted.
Okay, we have 3 minutes, so this will close us out, 1 and 2. And then
My name is Peter Feynman, and my question sort of piggybacks on the question that was just asked. That is, what will the role of Africa itself be in the commission's work? The Middle Passage, people didn't appear out of thin air. They came from cultures, tribes, countries. Will that be included right here in this building? And Michael's done a lot of work on that. He's very familiar with it, tracing it back to Congo, Angola, and so forth. Will that be part of this commission's study?
As we talked about earlier, that certainly an understanding of before Black people came to this country, were enslaved and brought to this country, is hugely important and significant. And that's something that the commission, I know, will be looking into. But at the same time, we want to pose the question, deepen in understanding that Africa was doubly exploited like no other place. Not only were millions of people enslaved and brought to this country, but the nation itself was colonized. And one of the most powerful questions we want to raise as we look at these issues and questions, if slavery was so bad, so evil, so cruel, why did it last so long? And there we have to really understand that the enslavement of Black people, the wars against the indigenous people, was about the extraction of wealth. Wealth, untold wealth. And that the enslavement of Blacks was due specifically to solve a question of labor And at the same time, the wars against the native people was about the acquisition of land to create new production sites for cotton. So as we tell these stories, we believe it is important to understand the why and how that why raises the question that our contributions to the society center around a battle over values. Do we place human dignity and the preciousness of human life at the center of our history? Or do we minimize human dignity and lose respect for the preciousness of human life? Because if you believe in dignity and the preciousness of human life, you can't have slavery. It can't exist. So yes, but before it is important.
Right, now I just had the last piece. We can't look to examine the tree without examining the roots.
I just have a quick question. Can you use the microphone? I wasn't expecting more. I can talk really loud. I thought you could. I have a question. I'm from the rural community. I'm working on an oral history project now with a friend in Cattaraugus County, and I'm wondering what you're doing around the histories of African Americans that were from a small town that I grew up in, because their experiences, have these stories that are not told. One of them is that they started a Muslim school in the 1960s, but the public school would not pick up the African American students who lived on what was Beech Tree Hill Road. They had to walk to the bottom of the hill, and this was just in the 60s. So I'm wondering what we're doing to gather these kind of oral histories of our rural African American friends, relatives, neighbors, loved ones, because it's a very different story than what is always happening and being told as if African Americans only lived in urban areas. And they don't, but their numbers were small, but they had a presence, and it created, there were tensions, there was a lot of growth experiences, and there were a lot of joyous experiences when different immigrant groups came in to these small farming communities that were predominantly German. And then we had the African Americans that were there from the slave histories, and Polish and Italians. But just what are we getting, what are the oral history projects, and are you looking at what the rural communities, rural African American communities? So that's your
Question about what the commission is doing around the history of rural communities as it relates to African presence, African American presence, Black influence. Yes.
Great. So I'll take that, because that has been one of the important parts of our framework, is making sure that we don't look at just urban communities. And I'm going to channel one of my commissioners who's not with us, Mr. Berry from Auburn, who has done a lot of work in terms of researching the histories of African American communities in central New York. So that's an important part of our story. I think it's an important part of this commission's work to support the research and the scholarship around community stories, and really making sure that they are heard and shared, not just amongst that community, but amongst the network of communities that make up the state of New York. And I think those stories are as important as the most well-known stories. And it's about how we uncover those, not just now, but into the future. Because we know from hearing from Lavada that we are only one book away from original archives and manuscripts. So much of the work that we're talking about, these stories, are happening right now. So that needs to happen, and that's part of the scholarship that I was referring to earlier about how we support that scholarship, not just the contemporary work that's happening, but also the historical work that continues to unearth those stories.
So I want to thank everyone for your attention and participation. I want to thank these commissioners for, again, this amazing work of coming, participating, learning, listening, and then doing the work of our commission as we are mandated to do. You can follow our website for more updates. Please continue to leave your public comments. As we look forward to the upcoming anniversaries in our state in 2026 and 2027, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind us all that it is recorded that in 1613, which would make this year the anniversary, Juan Rodriguez came here from San Domingue. He was not enslaved, and he traded, he married into a native community. And so our history, as I have been taught it, luckily blessed enough to be, is that slavery has never been the start of our history. Slavery's been a major disruption to our history. And so looking for those ways and reminders that we come from other places. We've been explorers, adventurers, merchants, clerics. They didn't come and take the worst, they came and stole the best. And so I thank you all for being here tonight. Also, Hip Hop 50, New York's the best. Have a good night.
Thank you. So I'll just take a quick motion to adjourn, Dr. Small. Gotta keep us formal. Do I see a motion to adjourn? Yes, so received. Seconded by Leslie Young. We are adjourned. Thank you.